and inspire us with Marx 200. And I was just doing a little preamble about the party and its struggle, Rob, before you came in. So welcome, Rob, and welcome to all of you, and it's great to see you here tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, comrades and friends, I've got to educate and inspire you, so no pressure there. My apologies for being a little late, but I must admit I have enjoyed my drive through the Somerset countryside. Half of my family, I don't admit this in Wales of course, but half of my family actually come from this part of the world, from Street and Midsummer Norton and Buckley and so on. And I've probably got more coal miners in the Somerset coalfield in my family background than I do in the South Wales coalfield. One day, one of my ambitions actually is to write a political history of the Somerset miners. Whether I'll get round to it is another question, but it's something I've thought about for a long time. Anyway, comrades, this meeting takes place 200 years after the birth of Karl Marx in 1818 in what the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm refers to as the Age of Empire. And at that time there were 5 great empires in the world at the time that Marx was born. The biggest in Europe by then, after a series of wars, was the biggest imperial power was Britain, followed by France, but also there were major empires possessed by Russia, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and the Chinese Empire. And in fact, in the course of the year 1818, the East India Company extended its territory across the coastal areas of India. The British armed forces were actually lent to the East India Company so that it could conquer new territory. And before the end of 1818, 190 million Indians actually lived under the rule of the East India Company. They didn't make any pretense back then about the economic interests that were at the basis of empire, rather than it being simply a Christian civilizing mission and all the rest of the propaganda. The East India Company ran large parts of India with the armed forces lent to it by the British state. The British Empire back then also consisted of what was called then British North America, in other words Canada, parts of the Caribbean, the tip of southern Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and eastern Australia. We hadn't yet completed the genocidal conquest of the rest of Australia and Tasmania. Spain was in the process, when Marx was born, of losing Chile in a war of national liberation. And the slave trade was beginning to come to an end. In Britain, of course, by then, industrialization was in full swing, based in part on the capital accumulated from the slave trade and empire. The first attempts had been made to establish trade unions by the industrial workers primarily, and that had resulted in the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800, making it unlawful for workers to combine together to try and fight for higher wages or shorter working hours. There was a rising tide of protest in Britain that culminated in 1819 in the infamous Peterloo Massacre and the 6 Acts that severely restricted people's democratic rights, the right to protest, the right to publish, the right to gather together in a public place, and so on. And the struggle for factory reform was just beginning. This was the world. These were the conditions into which Karl Marx was born, although of course he hadn't yet arrived in Britain. He did arrive here in August 1849, having been expelled from Paris and Brussels and Cologne and from Paris a second time. He arrived here in August 1849, as I've said, and for those in Britain today, particularly on the right of politics, of course, what I would place before them is what a great British tradition it is that we actually have a history of providing sanctuary to people fleeing persecution and destitution. In modern British history, there's perhaps not a great deal of to be proud of beyond the history of the working class and popular protest and so on. But for those who are traditionalists and who think we should always abide by the values of the past, there's one value for them to consider: the extent to which Britain was open to people fleeing persecution. Anyway, he'd been organising on the continent, he'd been organising in the Democratic Association and then the Communist League. Working class revolutions had broken out in parts of Europe in late 1847 and the beginning of 1848, and those were the conditions in Paris in which Marx had finalised the Manifesto of the Communist Party, published in 1848. That manifesto flowed from two of what Lenin later identified as the three sources and component parts of Marxism. And the first of those sources and component parts, very much reflected through much of the Communist Manifesto, was German philosophy, and in particular the materialist outlook that had gained ground in philosophical circles in Germany, a materialist outlook, not in the modern vulgar sense of the word, being all about acquisitions and acquisitiveness and so on, but actually dealing with the world, seeing the world as it really is, trying to understand it as it really is, without resort to any supernatural or superstitious explanations. That was the basis on which Marx was analysing society, was seeing society on its economic basis. After all, if we don't reproduce the essentials, the necessities of life, there wouldn't be any human life, there wouldn't be any human society. So Marx looked at the economic basis of human society and how it had changed over the ages, and then at what he called the superstructure, society's political and social and cultural institutions and movements and relationships and so on, which he identified as arising from the economic base. Once again, not in a crude, vulgar kind of way that lazy pseudo-Marxists sometimes use and so on. It's a much more subtle relationship between the base and the superstructure than simply saying the superstructure arises from the base. It reacts back upon it, there's an interaction, there's a dialectical relationship between the two, and so on. And what Marx called the combination of the economic base, upon which ultimately everything else rests, and the superstructure, he called the mode of production. And looking back through human history, he identified and sought to explain how human society had gone through a series of transformations from one mode of production to another. Going right back to the earliest forms of human society, he identified what he called primitive communism. His lifelong partner and collaborator Engels researched much more about this and assisted Marx in much of his work in this particular field, but he went right back to primitive society, where there was a primitive communalism or a primitive communism, out of which arose certain relations of production. Because a surplus could finally be produced, however small, people entered into more and more settled relationships with one another, groups of people in relationships with one another and so on. And out of the conflicts of primitive communist society, arose slavery. Different forms of slavery, ancient slavery, as in ancient Greece and Rome and so on, and other forms of slavery arose, but Marx characterized that mode of production as the slave mode of production. Out of that developed, again through conflict, through clashes, through contradictions, out of that developed feudalism, with the big landowning class, and in the end, the serfs, the peasants, and so on. Other layers in between, of course. And then Marx explained in the Communist Manifesto in summary, but in other works in much more detail, he explains how out of feudalism arose the society of the 19th century, capitalism, with, again, two great classes in the end confronting one another. The capitalist class, which owned the means of production through capital, and the working class, which owned nothing. In fact, all they owned, certainly back in 1848 when the Communist Manifesto was published, all that most workers could say they owned were their own children. And it's from the Greek for child that the word proletarian comes. Because all that the working class could be said to own were their own children. And the proletarian class, what today I think we call the working class, is the other great class of capitalist society, but with other layers, again, in between. And Marx, again, in the Communist Manifesto, again, in very popular terms, if you haven't yet read it, it's well worth a read. It's one of the easier works of Marx to read, but in the Communist Manifesto, very much in a flamboyant and polemical style, he argues that out of capitalism must come the next mode of production in human development, what he called the communist mode of production. Now, a lot of this, certainly as far as we get to capitalism, a lot of this is nowhere near as controversial today as it would have been back then. Back then, many people thought that the form that society took had been the form that society had by and large always taken. Certainly nobody would have had much of a concept of anything before the last few decades of feudalism. That might still live on in the folk memory. But most people believed that this capitalist society in the mid-19th century, this was the permanent form of society. This is how it had always been in the past, and this is how it will continue to be in the future, although we might try and win and secure a few improvements and so on. And what Marx said was no human development based on the struggle between classes, based ultimately on the contradictions within each mode of production. That means that capitalism will, in the end, be replaced by a new mode of production, by communism, which he later identified as coming to exist in two stages, the lower stage and the higher stage. And in fact, it was after Marx's death that the lower stage of communism was increasingly referred to by Engels and others, and later Lenin, as socialism. Socialism is the lower stage of communism. Now, of course, a lot of people who would say they're socialist today, and I'm sure they're sincere and would like to see a socialist society, would like to keep that distance between socialism and communism, but actually that's what socialism it really is. It's the lower stage of communist society. There were other forms of socialism back in Marx's time, and the manifesto attacks them: reactionary forms, idealist forms, propaganda forms. The word was used to fool people very often, that society could be changed for the better, but please don't use any revolutionary methods. And it's that abuse of the term socialism that Marx attacked back in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, although, as I say, later the word socialism was appropriated almost exclusively for the lower stage of communism. And that's what it still represents today for anybody who regards himself as being in the tradition, the ideological tradition of Karl Marx. The other one of the three sources and component parts of Marxism that runs through the Communist Manifesto is that of revolutionary politics, derived in particular from the French insurrectionary political tradition. That in every mode of production there is a struggle between the classes. It's inevitable. It's not a matter of choice. It arises from the very nature of the relations of production and so on. And in the end, that class struggle will have to be resolved in the only way that it can ultimately be resolved. And that is by the defeat of one class by another class. And that defeat, that political defeat ultimately, because it means capturing political power, state power, that defeat of one class by another means that the transformation of society from one mode of production to another can be accelerated and completed. And again, as I say, that's the second of the three sources and components of Marxism that one sees running through the Communist Manifesto. It was really only after Marx came to Britain that he could make a detailed study and analysis of what was then the most modern industrial form of capitalist society by studying the economy in Britain, and that gave rise to the third of the three great sources and component parts of Marxism: English political economy. Applying that analysis to capitalism, again, was one of the great works of Marx in the three economic manuscripts that he produced between 1857 and 1865. He gave some of them the subtitle or the title of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Up until Marx's economic manuscripts, some of which then became Volume 1 of Capital, up until that time, the study of the economy was dominated by classical political economists, who of course wanted to study and then present the economy with all of the class struggle taken out, with all of the politics taken. It was economics with the politics taken out. And so the great political economists from Adam Smith onwards, their analysis held that, well, of course the working class does a lot of the work, that's undeniable, but they get their fair reward in terms of their wage. The landowner contributes to the wealth of society by making his, and it usually was a he of course, by making his land available for production. And so he gets rent. And the capitalist takes risks with his capital, he puts capital into the production process, and in return he gets profit. So everybody can work together, everybody can collaborate, and everybody sooner or later will get their just rewards, whether in terms of labour or rent, or profit. Wages or rent or profit. And of course, what capital, particularly what Volume 1 of Capital, what it does is to completely explode this whole theory of classical political economy. Because Marx argues and he proves that in fact labour, people's labour power is ultimately the source of all wealth. Capital on its own produces nothing. Land on its own produces nothing. Unless labour is applied to land and to machinery and to tools and to raw materials, nothing gets produced. And from that, Marx developed a proper theory, labour theory of value, or more precisely, a theory of labour exploitation, or a theory of surplus value. It's given a number of different names, in which he showed that especially in a society, capitalist society, in which almost everything that's produced is a commodity. It's produced for sale in the marketplace. Look around this room now. Just about everything in it was produced as a commodity. It was produced to be bought and sold. sold and bought rather, to put it the right way around. And it was produced ultimately by human labour power. And Marx said this is the source of all wealth. So where in fact does capitalist profit come from? I mean, the capitalist can go put a pile of money in a factory, but it produces nothing. The landowner can step back from the land, but it produces nothing. Ultimately, everything is produced by human labour power, and in capitalist society, almost everything is a commodity. So, how do we determine what the real source of the value of that commodity is? And how is it that commodities can be exchanged for money, which can then be exchanged for other commodities, and there seems to be a more or less usually settled relationship between those things? Certain things will always cost a lot more than other things. The ratio might change a little bit because of imbalances in supply and demand and so on. But basically, especially over time, there's a fairly established relationship between, say, the value of a house and the value of a box of matches. Or even two different commodities that seem to be a lot closer together. And Marx said because ultimately the value of every commodity is based upon the amount of human labour time that has gone into its production. Not just by the current workforce, but by the workforces in the past that have made the raw materials available, that have produced, that have made the machines, that have made the tools, that have supplied, generated and supplied the electricity, and so on. And Marx said, so given all this, given that capital actually produces nothing, human labour power produces it, well, where does profit actually come from? And what Marx discovered, before actually Volume 1 of Capital, but Capital lays it out more clearly than anywhere else, at least up until that time, what Marx discovered was human labour power, which itself is a commodity under capitalism, to be bought and sold in a marketplace. He said human labour power has a unique capacity. Unlike machines and tools that are simply used up and their value is transferred in the course of the production process, he said human labour power actually creates value, expands value. It creates more value than it needs to consume in order to keep going. In other words, human labour power can create more value in a day than the wage that needs to be paid for it so that it can buy life's necessities and raise the next generation of labour power and pay for any dependents and so on. The worker produces surplus value, value over and above the value of the wage to buy the things they need to consume so they can get up the next morning and go into work. Surplus value. This surplus value is ultimately the source of capitalist profit. And in fact, I've got a book coming out, not quite ready in time for today, but it will be out at the weekend, Marx's Das Kapital and Capitalism Today, in which I've managed to research some of the very latest calculations of just how much value the average productive worker in Britain produces and how much of that value they get back in the form of their wages. And those calculations, done by people far more proficient at these matters than me, those calculations indicate that the average productive worker in Britain working for a capitalist employer, after about 3.5, 4 hours of an 8-hour day, has produced a value equivalent to the purchasing power, to the value of their wage. Everything else after that is surplus value for the employer. And they reap that surplus value when they sell the commodities that are being produced. Then, of course, they have to pay interest on capital they may have borrowed. They have to pay rent. And so other sections of the capitalist class also get a cut. But all of this is what is laid out very clearly in Capital, as well as other things. He also looked at the role that oppression, the oppression of women. There's an enormous amount in Volume 1 of Capital about the super exploitation of women workers, of which there were many, and there were many of them in Marx's day. In all of the popular presentations of Marxist political economy, summaries of his work, presentations of his work, and so on, and you know, over about 40 years, I think I've read most of them, virtually none of them give any special attention to this aspect of capital. And yet it's there, page after page after page, the terrible conditions, the enormous exploitation of all workers, but particularly of women and children. He cites one case, by the way, of Mary Ann Walkley, who worked for a haberdasher employer in London. She worked non-stop, without going home. She slept on the floor. She worked non-stop in the factory for 28 days and then dropped dead. At the inquest, her wealthy employer came along and was most put out that she had died without finishing the last batch of work. Marx reports all this in detail, and so much else besides. So I hope I've redressed some of that imbalance, anyway, in the book that I've just done. But there are other forms of oppression, of course. The oppression of migrant and immigrant workers, the oppression of, in effect, slaves, and of course we still have modern slavery today. And all of this can produce super profit. The oppression of people in the third world, in developing countries and so on. This produces over and above the normal profit that capitalists make here in Britain and the advanced capitalist countries. Again, in other parts of capital, deal with what today we would call alienation, but which Marx called estrangement. He said, look, if there is such a thing as human nature, I mean, there are some basic human instincts. And one of those instincts, that human nature, if you like, is that people create order out of chaos. They work, they produce. It's in our nature. If we're not paid to produce, people have all kinds of hobbies, don't they? In which they're doing things. Producing things, either materially or intellectually, and so on. And Marx said it's the most natural human activity to do something constructive, to do something productive. For most people. And yet, he says we spend more than half of our lives working at work that we don't enjoy, that is not fulfilling. He said, and what's more, we produce products that don't belong to us. We don't feel any great connection with them. They're taken away from us. The next time we see them, they'll be on a supermarket shelf, staring down at us like alien phenomena. So he says the worker is most at home when he's working at home, but when he's working in the factory, he's not at home. And there's that fundamental dichotomy between our natural instinct to create and be productive, and yet when we are creating and being productive, we're not enjoying it at all. Even though we're getting paid for it very often, we're not enjoying it. And again, there are some many passionate sections of Capital, by the way, but there are passionate purple passages in Capital that deal with estrangement. Marx also explained how capitalism is a system of crisis. It's built in to the very way in which capitalism operates. Who owns the means of production? Who has to sell their labour power to work the means of production, or the means of distribution, or the means of exchange? And he says capitalism has built into it, because of its need to exploit labour power, it has built into it crises of periodic overproduction. Capitalism produces more goods than can be sold at a profit. And Marx makes the point, under feudalism, if the village or the farm produced a surplus, people would be dancing around the maypole. They'd say, this is wonderful. What happens when a glut is produced under capitalism? Things aren't sold. Orders are cut back for machinery and tools and raw materials. workers are laid off. So there's even less purchasing power in the economy. So even less gets sold. More workers are laid off. Before you know it, you're into recession, and at some point even into a vicious slump, until labour and commodities needed for production become so cheap, it's worth buying them again. Then the economy starts to pick up, more people are taken on at work, they've got more money to spend, more can be produced, but then what happens? The recovery turns into an expansion and a boom. And then you're on the way up to the next crisis as the economy then comes down. And that's been the history of capitalism. That's been the history of capitalism in every capitalist country. The economic cycle, as well as the structural crises that arise. Because capitalism is essentially, outside of the individual enterprise, it's essentially an unplanned system. So, again, capital lays all this bare. It lays bare the fundamental contradictions of a mode of production in which we all collaborate in different ways with one another. We're all interrelated. You look at the production of everything, and it relies upon the production of something else. It relies on distribution. It relies on sale. It relies on raw materials. It relies on all kinds of supplies. In that sense, capitalism is actually a very social mode of production. The whole of society is engaged in some way or another in it, and we're all interdependent. And yet, he says, capitalism is a social mode of production, and yet the ownership and control of the system, and in particular of the means of production, the workplaces, the industrial land, the plant, the premises, and so on, by a tiny minority of the population. Private ownership of the means of production, but a social system of production. That's a fundamental contradiction. And he said that would bring about that contradiction between what he called the social forces of production and the private relations of production. That contradiction, in the end, can only be resolved by the means of production also being taken into social ownership. In order for that to happen, the working class would have to take political power out of the hands of the capitalist class and its political representatives in order to bring about the end of capitalism as a mode of production and to start the construction of a communist mode of production. Anyway, Marx then, of course, as he'd done in the past, he also combined theory with practice. In 1864, he helped to found the International Working Men's Association, which brought together émigré workers groups in Britain, especially from Germany, but others as well. Émigré workers groups from other parts of Europe and North America, together with the trade union movement that was now in the process of being built, initially largely amongst the skilled workers, but then before too long amongst large groups of unskilled workers today. And the International Working Men's Association, with its workers' groups, its socialist groups, its trade unions, that was organised across large parts of Western Europe and North America, but it was based in London. And Marx had the closest relations with the trade union leaders of the day. Even though he disagreed with quite a few of them, he thought they were rather too respectable, they were rather too cautious, they were rather too conservative with a small c. They certainly didn't want anything as unrespectable as any kind of revolution here in Britain. But nevertheless, he realised the importance of the working class becoming more and more organised, joining together, and acting in solidarity with one another when they were under attack or fighting for decent improvements to their pay and conditions and so on. And if you read the, I'm not suggesting, perhaps the insomniacs amongst you might want to do this. If you read the minute books of the General Council of the International Working Men's Association, you see that they're full of requests from workers in struggle across Britain across Western Europe, in North America and everywhere else, asking for solidarity, asking for financial contributions, asking for solidarity action, asking for certain goods to be blocked, and so on. And this is what Marx, of course, regarded as essential for the working class. If it was to build its own strength, come to realise its own strength, and to understand that with solidarity, and international solidarity, then the capitalist system itself could be challenged. In the International Working Men's Association eventually disintegrated after the defeat of the Paris Commune in 1871, but trade unionism was still being built, increasingly so in Britain, and so too we were seeing the first working class parties, political parties being established. Not just the parties of the wealthy and of the middle class and so on, but parties that claim to represent the interests of the working class. Socialist parties, workers' parties, labour parties in Britain and other advanced capitalist countries. And again, Marx and Engels very much engaged with them. Some of them they were very critical of. They thought they were unambitious. They believed they could just make minor adjustments to the capitalist system and it could be made to run perfectly well in the interests of everybody. Marx wouldn't have anything to do with that kind of nonsense. But nevertheless, he tried to be constructive, if sometimes rather cutting, in his criticism. Now, of course, since Marx's death in 1883, we've seen mass socialist parties and social democratic parties being established. Here in Britain, of course, but also in many other parts of the world, especially in the advanced capitalist countries. We've also seen how many of those parties have adapted to the capitalist system. They think it can be improved and reformed, and that is all that's necessary. In fact, they see their mission as to run the capitalist system more fairly than the capitalists. An opportunist outlook. We've seen them become, many of them become vehicles for careerism, parliamentary careerism in particular. We've seen the degeneration of the social democratic parties that believe in collaborating with the capitalist class rather than challenging it, that believe that the capitalist state apparatus is basically neutral. And provided we can get the right kind of government elected, then we'll be able to make the changes and the reforms that are necessary. Although Marx himself always argued and said in the Communist Manifesto that the state, the capitalist state, is a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. It's not neutral. It was designed and built and staffed in order to serve the interests of those who own the capital. And on those grounds, again, towards the end of his life, he clashed very sharply with some of the new German and French socialist parties and some of the socialist organisations in Britain on that question. And then, of course, we've had the impact on those parties of imperialism, of the spread of capitalism across the world, dominated by giant corporations whose interests are served by the states that they come from and in which they're based. The British state serves the interests of British transnational corporations around the world in a whole number of different ways. The American state does likewise, the German state, the Japanese state, the French state, and so on. And in the clash between these different interests, of course, we saw arising from that the First Imperialist War, the Great War of 1914-1918, when so many of the social democratic and socialist parties, and in Britain, the majority leadership of the Labour Party, after years of saying we will never allow an imperialist war to take place. If one capitalist class decides our country must go to war against another capitalist class, then we will organise general strikes, we will organise sabotage, we will do whatever's necessary to prevent workers killing each other in their millions on behalf of their own capitalist classes. But once the bugle of war was sounded and the drums of war were beating in 1914, almost all of the social democratic parties said, well, we'd better do the patriotic thing. We'd better support the war effort of our rulers, with, of course, terrible, tragic consequences. And in the course of that war, we saw the power of the state being mobilized in total in the interests of the capitalist class of each country. And Lenin, in fact, said what the process that was happening here was that the political power of the state was in effect fusing with the economic power of the monopolies to create a system of capitalism, state monopoly capitalism. Out of that war came the Bolshevik Revolution, came the founding of communist parties, came the foundation of the international communist movement, and as well as taking forward the class struggle in the different countries with the objective of socialist revolution, on the basis of opposing the imperialism of their own ruling class, as well as of other ruling classes. Those communist parties and workers' parties also took a very clear position on the colonial struggle, the struggle against colonialism, in solidarity with the national liberation movements, in the struggle against fascism, which is a direct outcrop of capitalist crisis. In the struggle against fascism, of course, the communists and others on the left played the leading role in trying to alert people to the dangers of fascism and why ultimately it must be fought. And it was a classic definition of fascism from Dimitrov, Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist International, that guided the action that communist parties and others on the left took. He said it was fascism is the open terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and the most imperialist elements of finance capital. In other words, he understood there was a class basis to fascism. It's not just about people being nasty to Jews or to black people or to trade unionists or to socialists or to communists. Once fascism becomes a mass movement, that is because it is now being backed by a capitalist class under threat that can see the role that fascist movements can play in terms of dividing people and destroying the working class movement. And of course there's been the ongoing struggle for reforms in the capitalist countries, always to be fought for, but never will be enough because they won't do away with capitalism as a system. And of course the struggle for socialist revolution. I don't have enough time today. It's in the book, it's in other publications that we produce, but of course we also know that there have been victories in terms of socialist revolution. We've had socialist revolutions, but we've also seen those revolutions ultimately be defeated and reversed and so on. And again, it's very important that everybody on the left studies those whole experiences, not with too many preconceived notions that everything that happened in the Soviet Union was good, or that everything that happened in the Soviet Union was bad, and so on, but that we make serious study of what happened in these different socialist countries to see why and how things went wrong, so that we can learn lessons for the future. And of course today, Marxist ideas today are probably undergoing their biggest revival for a long period of time. And that's because, in a sense, capitalism has returned to normal. We had quite a long period of more or less uninterrupted economic growth in most of the major capitalist countries, economies, from the late 1940s to the mid-1960s. Many of us may have grown up in that period, and we thought it was normal. You left school, you either went straight into an apprenticeship or a job, or you went to college. When you came out of college, you went into a job. Your wages would go up every year. You'd get a house, you'd have a family, and you'd retire, you'd have a half-decent pension, just about enough to live on. That's what we were brought up to expect. That was normal. Of course, we're now finding out that was a freak period in the history of British capitalism. It wasn't like that before, And it's not been like it since the late 1980s or early 1990s, as I'm afraid the younger generation is now finding out directly for itself. House ownership, full employment, rising wages every year, these only happened in a freak period as far as capitalism is concerned. So there's great interest in the ideas of Marxism, not only because they still continue to explain capitalism and how it works, they still continue to put forward the reasons why capitalism has to be ended as an exploitative, oppressive and militaristic system, and why capitalism has to be replaced by socialism. And I'll just end by saying, of course, no set of ideas, no theory can remain unchanged. That would be quite contrary to what Marx himself taught. So Marxist ideas today also have to take account, not just of the rise of militarism, the military blocs, the super-capitalist blocs like the European Union and so on, but also we have to take full account, we have to analyse and understand and come forward with the policies that will deal with the ecological challenge, with the energy crisis, with the problems of huge migrations of people set in motion by capitalist exploitation and capitalist war and so on. We have to look again at why capitalist crisis is now normal. We haven't even recovered fully from the crisis of 2007, 2008. And by the way, read what Marx had to say about the bankers and the speculators and the City of London of his day. You'd recognise it all, because it's exactly what was happening in the period leading up to 2007 and 2008. So, comrades, sorry if I've gone on a little bit. As George Bernard Shaw said, I didn't have time to prepare a shorter speech. But just to say that the ideas of Marx live on, and they're probably more popular now, better understood now than they've been for decades. And so I'll finish with that last section of the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848, especially the bits that sometimes are not always included in the quotations. He and Engels wrote this: "Let the ruling class tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of all lands unite."
Thank you very, very much for that. And although we've promised to be out absolutely at 9 o'clock, I think we've got time for some questions and comments. And because we've only got, say, about 20 minutes, what I'm suggesting is that we give you a pen, and that you've got one, and that
yours from the other night.
Mine from the other night, okay. And that what we do is to take questions and comments up to about between 8:45 to 9, and that then you roll together answering those and the summing up. Is that okay?
Yep,
and leave just a few minutes for notices and anything that anyone wants to announce. So I'll just see who wants to say something or ask a question.
I can.
Okay, yes,
Hello.
Alan.
Yeah, my name's Alan Devon from Taunton. We've met before.
We have.
We've talked before. I'm just trying to think, if I'm a communist, I mean, I'm a Green Party member, but at heart I'm a communist, I think. Where are the communes? Because when it comes to Commonwealth, common ownership, cooperative movement I'm involved in, we've got a community land trust in Taunton where we're trying to develop housing for people in housing need. So as far as I can see, if I was a communist, if I was Karl Marx, my vision, to some extent, I've been a councillor in Taunton for 18 years, Taunton Borough Council, which I was deselected in 2003, and I'm a parish councillor at the moment. But I always think to myself, I used to say to the Taunton councillors, we need to take over the whole of this area, the whole of Taunton Dean, and in other words, buy everything. Well, you could say the same with the parish council. In other words, we declare UDI, and from there on, we lease everything out to people. In other words, they can stay more or less where they are. This is to do with land reform to some extent, and also reform, I suppose, of industry to go for the cooperative model. But I mean, to me, yeah, communism has got to be associated with, as I say, commonwealth ownership, people doing things together. And instead, in my lifetime, same as yours, I'm coming up to 78, in my lifetime I've seen individualism, materialism, consumerism become the commanding heights of people's ambitions today. You know, in other words, as you say, good job, big house, big car, and it's announced on television. You know, when somebody wins the lottery, you think, well, you know, poor devils are going to be roasting in hell. You know, in other words, if you take, just lastly, if you take the Christianity to some extent realigned to communism in the sense of the Beatitudes or in the sense of the camel and the eye of the needle, I mean, how is it we've got into this sort of incessant idea of growth and materialism and more of everything, when nearly all religions of the world, to some extent communism religion, are saying the exact opposite. You think an announcement on the telly, somebody won the lottery, you say, poor devil, you know, roasting in hell, you know, condemned forever, you know, the hellfire.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
And then Muslims actually condemn usury. I mean, where does usury fit in? People making money out of damn money.
Okay, who's next? Comments, questions? Yes.
Hi, yeah, I'm Paul Christian. So, very interested to hear what you're saying about Marxist ideas coming back into fashion, because clearly this is, you know, this is happening in Spain, for example, with Demos and such forth. So, I wanted to get your thoughts if you've read any of this stuff by Aaron Bastani about fully automated communism, and also just generally about like, the potential that technology has. We could harness technology to be to the common good and common ownership. It could be so easy to suddenly take control of stuff.
Thank you. Ken?
I don't think we should let the day pass without meeting pass without some reference to Jeremy Corbyn and the latest phenomenon in the Labour Party, which shows a lot of things. How do you see that in relation to the struggle of socialism? Is it a revolutionary breakthrough or not, or possibly?
Still back in nuclear bombs and nuclear power.
Anyone else? Yes, Bevis.
On the world scale, clearly the power of China has developed dramatically since the it's now one of the major economic powerhouses in the world. Its leadership was claimed to be Marxist. What's your view?
John?
Yeah, thanks for coming. I think one aspect that maybe is worth bringing into it is the experiences of the Paris Commune, insofar as just how violent the ruling classes are, and we've seen that in countless colonial wars, and we see it in Syria, we see it all the time around the world. And in relation to the rest of the world and us, you know, essentially now we're living with capitalism, and capitalism is toxic for everyone in the world, and its toxicity is getting increasing. Well, it's increasing. It's a bit. We're coming into a period. In one way, the sort of the First World War is in the past, but in another way, the actual crisis for the planet, for people, the contrast between rich and poor, the concentration of wealth, the crisis is actually got, you know, it's supercharged now, and this is where, you know, the unity of revolutionary forces is really important, but also grasping what is going on as opposed to being, if you like, blinkered by our own prejudices.
Thank you. Anyone else? Marx. Yes,
Just a quick, just a question about the Communist Party and Russia. I think Stalinism has discredited socialism in the eyes of the masses and discredited communism in the eyes of the masses. And the way that the Soviet Union treated Cuba, where they stopped the oil and that sort of thing because Cuba didn't behave in a Stalinist way. I'd just like to know your point of view about that.
Anyone else? Okay, that's quite a set of questions, Rob. So,
Well, thank you very much, because actually almost all the questions were addressed at all the bits that I had to leave out, because I spent so much time on the first half of the notes that I prepared. So I'm very grateful you've given me the opportunity to actually, I won't take quite as long, right, but you've given me the opportunity to complete what I was planning to say. First of all, I mean, more or less in the order, if you like, in which the questions were raised. In terms of communes and cooperatives, as part of the model of a new form of society, a new mode of production. In preparing, I'm sounding a bit like a salesperson now, my apologies, I haven't even got copies here to sell you. But in the book that I've just prepared, which is based on 3 articles that I had in the Communist Review, the theoretical journal of the Communist Party, what I didn't spend enough time on in those articles, and I've corrected it in the book, is the enormous amount that Marx had to say, quite a bit anyway, about cooperatives. Not just about Robert Owen's experiments, of which he was by and large quite complimentary. It's unfortunate that the reference in the Communist Manifesto, the critical reference to utopian socialism, again has been misinterpreted and misunderstood, as though it was a damning of all experiments in cooperatism. That wasn't Marx's position at all, or Engels' position. And so that intrigued me, and I went into that more deeply. And in particular, I looked at what has been attempted as far as cooperatives are concerned in the in the former Soviet Union, in the socialist economies of Eastern Europe, and in Cuba and China today. And there is a rich history. It's not always positive, I'll grant you that. But nevertheless, there was an enormous amount of experimentation. And in fact, for large parts of the post-war period, in Eastern Europe, there was a powerful cooperative movement in many of those countries. In the GDR, in Hungary, many of the houses were owned by housing cooperatives. The farming cooperatives still survive in Hungary and Bulgaria, and it's the capitalist state that wants to shut them down and to privatise them and commercialise them and so on, fully. So there's actually an enormous amount to read and to think about and to learn from, as far as, you know, the cooperative. I mean, in other times, in other countries at other times, the socialist state actually greatly restricted, having first encouraged cooperatives, because that was very much in the tradition of Lenin. They then restricted cooperatives, quite probably unnecessarily. I don't feel entirely competent enough to pass a definitive judgment, but there's plenty there that's worth reading. This idea, by the way, that the whole of Eastern Europe, or the Soviet Union for that matter, was some great grey mass, a great big concentration camp, all uniform, all conservative, nothing, no experimentation, is completely false. Completely false. For all that was wrong as well with those societies, there was also enormous variations between them, including on the whole question of cooperatism. If you look at Cuba today, there's been a flowering of the cooperative movement. Urban farming being one example. Other forms of agriculture. Some of the energy projects that are taking place there. So again, lots to study. China is also now seeing a flourishing of the cooperative movement in a number of different spheres of industry and social life and so on. So I absolutely agree with you. I think we on the left and probably communists as much, if not more than others, and certainly those who regard themselves as Marxists, I think we have tended to disregard the importance of this as an element in the new society. That's what Marx says, quite explicitly in Capital. He refers to workers' cooperatives as being a sign of what we can have in the future, in the communist mode of production. Now, how that combines with centralised economic planning is interesting. It needn't necessarily be impossible. But again, these are the kind of issues we also have to grapple with and so on. So I'm really glad you raised that. The whole question of land ownership, again, different systems operated in the different countries of Eastern Europe, in China, in Russia, in Cuba today. All worth studying. Public leasehold systems of land ownership, cooperative systems of land ownership, outright central nationalisation of land. There's different models and experiments that were tried. And we need to learn from that. We need to study it and learn from it. And your reference to Christianity, and if you like, Christian communism was also interesting. I've got another book out towards the end of the year. It's an update of the biography of S.O. Davis, the great socialist MP for Merthyr Tydford. Still holds the world record for the number of times to be expelled from the Parliamentary Labour Party, 5 times. And when he was asked, there was no doubt about his socialism, he was asked where his ideas came from. He said, my socialism derives from the Sermon on the Mount. And one of the early influences on him was R.J. Campbell's The New Theology, which was an early form of liberation theology, if you like. So again, we have to be non-dogmatic and study all of these things and see if they can enrich our Marxist understanding and our practice as socialists and communists and so on. Is it Paul mentioned technology? Again, I'm sorry, it's been left out. It was left out of my talk. It's in my notes, promise, and there's certainly some in the book and so on, about this whole question of automation. I mean, what we can be reasonably confident of is if robotics, artificial intelligence and all the rest of it, if that proceeds unchecked on the basis of capitalist ownership and control, then in many places, in many countries at different times in the future, the working class will pay a heavy price for the way in which it will be introduced, because it will not be introduced, this automation, the whole process will not be carried forward and even revolutionised. It won't be done in the interests of workers. It won't even be done necessarily in the interests of the whole of society. It'll be done in the interests of maximising profit. And if that means mass redundancies from time to time, then as far as capitalism is concerned, that will be necessary. It won't be planned. It won't be planned across the economy. It'll only be planned by the individual monopoly enterprise. And so the disruption, the periodic poverty, the unemployment, that will be the price that workers will pay, when actually, of course, automation could be used to liberate workers from the most onerous tasks, the most repetitive tasks. More free time, more leisure time, more family time. This is what could result from automation, but not on the basis of capitalism, which those are not the objectives of automation as far as capitalism is concerned. So again, we have to face the fact that the pressures for automation are growing and the technical possibilities and potential for automation is there. How can we ensure that it goes forward in the interests of the mass of ordinary people and society as a whole? I don't think we'll be able to do that without socialism. Jeremy Corbyn, a revolutionary breakthrough. Well, we had the Communist Party organises, we've got a big event, we've played a major part in organising coming up on Saturday, Marx 200 in London. I'm not advertising because all the tickets were long sold out, I'm afraid. It'll be full. But we've organised these kind of events from time to time, more or less annually. And it wasn't so long ago we had a school on 21st century socialism where I was in conversation with Jeremy Corbyn. He used to regularly speak at our schools, by the way. We've always had very friendly relations with Jeremy. And I was more or less asking him questions, and then we were having a discussion about the role of a socialist in Parliament. This was about 3-4 years ago. I don't think either of us suspected for a moment he was soon to become the leader of the Labour Party. And of course it does represent a breakthrough. It does represent, the potential is there for it to be a great step forward. Yes, he's in a minority in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Yes, he has to abide by the official policies of the Labour Party until he can change them, if he can change them. And that's what needs to be done. But we also have to understand, unfortunately, in one sense, he's not a dictator in the Labour Party. And so he can't unilaterally change Labour's policy on nuclear weapons or the European Union or anything else. But the struggle is on in the Labour Party. And clearly, as far as the ruling class in Britain is concerned, they are terrified at the prospect of a government in Britain led by Jeremy Corbyn. They are terrified of it. And if you think you're seeing an horrendous daily smear campaign today, I'm afraid we ain't seen nothing yet. The nearer we get to that election, and the more likely it might look that he could win it, I've got an idea about what's going to be dredged up. All kinds of things will be dredged up. And of course, should he win, and that's what we need, and I have to disagree with my friend and comrade here, you know, I'm afraid I think anything other than the maximum Labour vote everywhere, that's all that's going to hold out any prospect of winning that general election. Now, I know there are seats where Labour is a long way behind, but I'll tell you what, there were twice as many of those seats before the last general election. Labour has now put itself into a winnable position from what everybody used to say, a lot of people, was a wasted vote. So we've got to get that Labour government elected. But that Labour government is going to face enormous hostility of every kind. Not just propaganda in the newspapers. It's going to face all kinds of economic sabotage and disruption and so on, unless it capitulates, of course.
The Green Party are taking a different attitude at the moment.
So, you know, the movement, we on the left, we have to acknowledge this. We have to be realistic about it, not pessimistic, but we have to be realistic about it. Now, when I was in that conversation with Jeremy, the line from a number of the left-wing groups in Britain then was unions should disaffiliate from the Labour Party. Socialists should leave the Labour Party. It's finished. It'll never be a vehicle for progress. Come and join us. We'll replace it. And so on. The Communist Party's position was different. We said for as long as Labour had an organic link with the organised working class movement, the trade unions in Britain, then the fight must continue to reclaim the Labour Party as a vehicle for the Labour movement. And we never gave up that struggle. We never took a defeatist line. Largely because we said the left and the Labour movement hasn't even put up a fight yet. Only when it puts up a fight will we be able to be sure whether the Labour Party could be reclaimed or not. It hasn't been fully reclaimed yet, by the way. Nevertheless, the struggle goes on. And we took the position we did on the basis of our strategic analysis of the forces at work in Britain. And it's in this party programme, Britain's Road to Socialism. That said in 2011, the battle was still on to try and reclaim the Labour Party. It was against disaffiliation. It was urging the left to support, all of the left, to support the left wing inside the Labour Party, even if you were outside it, which is where the Communist Party has no option but to be at the present time. Anyway, we've just brought out a draft of an updated programme that since 2011 takes account, of course, of what's happening in the Labour Party. It looks forward to the possibility of a left-led Labour government in Britain and what it might face and how it has to be defended and so on. And so I am going to be a salesperson here. I would urge you, buy the programme, read it, discuss it, let us know what you think. It's not the finished product yet. We want to hear what others on the left, Labour movement activists, Green Party activists, we want to hear what people have to say. Because our intention is, it's a weapon for the movement. Of course it promotes the Communist Party and the role of the Communist Party. But it is much, much more than that. Right, the last few questions. China. Well, again, I'm about to go to China again for a 10-day period. A symposium on Marx 200, a visit to, cooperatives, I hope, as last time, to factories, discussions with the trade union movement there, discussions with leading members of the Chinese Communist Party and so on. Doesn't make me an uncritical admirer of China, even though this will be about the 5th time I've gone there. Doesn't make me an uncritical admirer. I can see the problems. I can see the things that are done in a way that we certainly wouldn't be likely to do them in Britain and so on. But I'd also say this, what is happening in China is so enormous it's almost beyond our comprehension. The changes that are taking place in China are absolutely earth-shaking. That's before we consider China's economic intervention in the international economy. And by the way, most of the giant Chinese multinational corporations are state-owned. Not a lot of people realise that. They're in public ownership. And their whole approach to their operations in the third world bear little relation to how capitalist transnational corporations have operated there. I'm not saying they're all saints, but there is a significant difference, as many people in the third world would testify. So what's happening in China is absolutely enormous. The implications for the whole world are enormous. They've lifted 700 million people out of absolute poverty. Even the World Bank, not a socialist institution, the World Bank has said this is a feat unequalled in human history. And of course Western propagandists will say, well, that's because China's capitalist. No, that was done on the basis of what is still a centrally planned economy, key sections of which remain in public ownership, and it's done under the political rule of the Communist Party. That's not a straightforward capitalist economy by any means. So all I would say again is we have an enormous amount to study and to learn from China. Critically, of course, not uncritically. We have an enormous amount, and I must say it does get a little tiresome, especially when you've seen with your own eyes the phenomenal change. I went to the capital of one of the eastern provinces in between Tibet and Mongolia. I went past miles of windmills producing power for that province. Windmill parks that are miles long. And they have built thousands of miles of motorways and railway lines to connect up these provinces with everywhere else. They're building 6 or 7 new airports every year. Not too environmentally sound, I know. They're also building 5 giant eco-cities that will be entirely self-sufficient in green, non-nuclear energy. What is being done in China is phenomenal. And so I would just make a plea, especially to friends on the left, who are experts in how every other country should be running its revolution, despite a significant lack of success when it comes to running our own. I would say, look, before rushing to judgment, make a serious study of what's happening in China. Try and understand it. Don't believe everything they say. Don't swallow everything the Communist Party says. But make a serious study before you rush to judgment that it's a return to capitalism and so on. In my view, it's not. The Chinese Communist Party say they are in the primary stage of building socialism and that it's going to take at least another 50 years. Yes, they're using some capitalist mechanisms. Yes, they're using private capital. By the way, that's in order to rip off Western technology on a giant scale. That's what's actually been happening. And it's now being utilised by publicly owned companies. But anyway, again, new pamphlet from the Communist Party, China's New Era and what it means. An enormous amount of information in there. Again, I think we need to be a little bit short on the preaching and a little bit longer on the serious study and analysis. The Paris Commune, the violence of the ruling class, we know what the ruling class is capable of. I've been reading the Mitrokhin papers. It's a strange kind of birthday present I get from my partner, but I've been reading the Mitrokhin papers. He was a defector from the KGB, and he came over to the West with an enormous amount of material. And it's been edited by Christopher Andrew, the official historian of MI5 and so on. And of course, it's all designed ultimately to tell you how evil and wicked the KGB and the Soviet Union were. But actually, to anybody who reads it with half a fair mind, It does the opposite. Because Andrew can't deny that across Latin America, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, the whole history of Western imperialism has been to support and arm and finance and train dictatorships and their death squads and their torturers. He can't deny that. He has to admit it. About El Salvador, about Chile, about Iran, about all kinds of places. And then he exposes, through the Mitrokhin papers, the evil machinations of the Soviet Union supporting the trade unions and the liberation movements and the socialist and communist parties that are fighting against these dictatorships. Well, of course, I'm reading this, scratching my head, thinking, well, fair play to the KGB. I didn't realise they had such a wonderful record of intervention across the world. And if anybody has any doubt about that, buy the 2 volumes. See for yourself. We're supposed to be shocked and horrified at this international communist conspiracy, as they're busy arming the liberation movements, providing funds and propaganda and weapons, not just the Soviet Union, the GDR, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, on a massive scale. The idea that after 1949 or whatever, the Soviet Union and the socialist countries retreated into this socialism in one country dogmatic outlook and we're not interested in revolution anywhere else. It's complete and utter nonsense. Imperialism understands that, by the way. There's just some on the left in Britain who don't understand it. Read the Mitrokhin papers. Marvellous. And they show you what the capitalist class is capable of. And what our capitalist class in Britain was quite prepared to support. You know, whether it's apartheid, South Africa, military dictatorships in Chile and Argentina, wherever you like. You know, it's a real eye-opener. And you're right about the concentration of wealth and so on, the role of transnational corporations in Britain. Again, I've put a lot of this in the latest. I've tried to gather as much of the most recent information and put it in the book. Final point. Yes, the Stalin period in the Soviet Union. There can't be any blank pages in history. It all has to be out in the open. It has to be faced up to, particularly by communists, particularly those who were in solidarity with the Soviet Union and were aligned with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the international communist movement. We have to look at that whole experience of the Stalin period in particular. We have to be truthful about it. We have to face up about the things that were wrong, that were cruel, that were even barbaric in many instances. Does that mean we swallow all of the Western propaganda? Of course not. I mean, when you read the figures, take any figure you like, multiply it by 10, and then add another dozen just for good measure. So that in the end, you know, the Stalin system apparently killed 20 million and 25 million, 40 million and so on. Many of those figures, by the way, include the Soviet war dead. I thought they were killed by the Nazis. Anyway, we have to face up to it. We have to learn the lessons from it. You know, the Soviet Union collapsed and counter-revolution took place because the Soviet Communist Party and the Soviet working class was not in a position to defend their system. In fact, many workers didn't feel that it was even their system to defend. We have to face up to that. We have to learn the lessons from it so that next time around, and there has to be a next time around we can build a socialist system that has humanity and democratic participation at the very core of it in ways that cannot be restricted and removed and so on. But does that mean that the Soviet Union was not fundamentally socialist? Again, I think anybody who reads and understands Capital would have no doubt at all that the economic essentials of the communist mode of production were the predominant characteristics of the Soviet economy and the economies of Eastern Europe, for all of the other distortions that took place there as well. I think that is the case. So yes, the Stalin period did do a lot of damage, but we also have to recognise, and again it's a great dilemma, it's one of the great dilemmas of history, the collectivisation of agriculture, the introduction of the 5-year plans, the mass-scale public ownership of industry. All of those things, however cruelly some of those policies were carried out, however inefficiently they were carried out, at the end of the day, they laid the economic foundation that made possible the defeat of Nazi Germany. Now, if you can tell me how you can, not you personally, if you can tell me how a semi-feudal, semi-capitalist, backward country can, within a decade, a period of a decade, go from being a largely rural, semi-feudal country to a country that can have the industrial base to build the military machine to tear the guts out of the Nazi war machine, as Winston Churchill put it. If there was another way of doing it that would have been done in just as quick a time, I'd love to know it, because we can try it next time.
Thank you very much.